Hello, is there anybody there?
There are days I remember with absolute clarity, and others that feel like they were borrowed from someone else's life. What unsettles me isn't fear or violence. We see enough of that in this job. It's the quiet contradictions. Numbers that don't match. Reports that rewrite themselves. People who swear they were never there. I've learned that memory isn't a straight line. Sometimes it folds back on itself and leaves you standing alone. Welcome to the Last Witness Files. We upload more interesting videos daily. Please subscribe if this story resonates with you. I've worked as a tribal police officer on the reservation for a little over 12 years. Long enough that the roads feel like muscle memory, even the ones that don't appear on county maps. Long enough that the radio chatter blends with the wind, and the silence between calls can stretch into something heavier than quiet. Out here, help is usually 30 or 40 minutes away, and the night has a way of cleaning bones and footprints alike. I don't dramatize the job. Most shifts are uneventful. Welfare checks. Family disputes that simmer instead of boil. Drunk driving. Cattle struck on the highway. We're not immune to serious crime, but on the reservation, news travels without needing reporters. When something happens, people tend to know, even if they won't talk. The case I'm talking about didn't start with screams or sirens. It started with a simple dispatch entry, a welfare check on an off-grid property about 30 miles from town. The caller was anonymous. They said calmly that someone hadn't been seen for days. No threats, no urgency, just absence. We get those sometimes. People here value privacy to the point it looks like disappearance. I glanced at the CAD terminal. The call had a case number, standard auto assignment, and I wrote it down in my notebook. I habitually rewrite case numbers. Habit keeps you grounded. A number ties the event to something physical. It anchors it. I didn't know yet how important that small act was. The drive out took nearly an hour. The dirt road was washed out in places, snow packed shiny and hard where the sun never touched. Sagebrush scratched the doors. The sky had that flat winter look, like someone had put a lid on the world. I kept the radio low and listened to the engine. The property was a weather-beaten trailer beside a dry creek bed, a windmill creaking behind it. No vehicle outside. No tracks except faint, iced-over prints that could have been weeks old. I knocked. Waited. Knocked again. I called out, identifying myself. Out here, you learn to speak clearly, without sounding like you're pushing your way in. The door was locked. Curtains closed. Protocol says you try contacts before forcing entry. Dispatch gave me a disconnected number and a relative 2 states away. While I waited for a callback, I walked the perimeter. No broken windows. No footprints newer than the last storm. It was quiet in a way that isn't peaceful. Just empty. Eventually, I had grounds to enter. I announced. Unlocked the door. Stepped inside. The first thing that struck me was the smell. Stale, but not decay. A heater had died days ago. Coffee cups on the counter. A book open on a table. Everything looked paused. Like the occupant had stepped out for a moment and never stepped back in. Food expired in the fridge. No signs of struggle. No note. No body. I cleared the rooms. Small space. 2 bedrooms. One packed with storage crates. The other had a neatly made bed and a pair of boots lined up underneath. In the bathroom, toothbrush, razor. Nothing dramatic. Just a missing person who hadn't declared themselves missing. I reported back, began my initial documentation. I read the case number aloud into my recorder, the one I had written earlier. Same digits. Routine. I checked the ID paperwork I found in a drawer, confirmed the name on tribal enrollment records, noted medications, took photos. All boring, necessary details. When I got back to the office, it was already dark. The building always feels older at night. The fluorescent lights hum and the hallways collect shadows at the edges. I sat down at my desk, logged the report, typed the case number into the system. Nothing came up. No records found. Just a blank page, like the search field hadn't processed. I tried again, slowly, digit by digit. Same result. I assumed the server was glitching. It happens. I pulled my notebook out. The number I'd copied earlier matched the dispatch card stuck to my clipboard. That reassured me more than it should have. I called dispatch. "Run that again," I asked. There was a pause, papers shuffling. "We don't have a call under that number," the dispatcher said. Calm. Routine. What incident type? "Welfare check," I said. Another pause. Longer this time. "Last welfare check we logged today was closer to town. Different number. Different address." I remember sitting there, pen in hand, listening to the heater kick on. I wasn't angry. I wasn't confused in the way people think confusion looks. It was more like a thread coming loose in a sweater. Small. Insignificant. But you see what happens if you keep pulling. I read the number again. I could hear her frown through the phone. She double-checked the logs. Nothing. She suggested, politely, that maybe I'd written it down wrong. I've made mistakes before. Everyone does. But the number was on the printed CAD card too. Clear as day. I thanked her. Hung up. Tried searching by the address instead. Still nothing. That's when the quiet started to expand. Because the system should never forget an address. Even unincorporated land has coordinates. I've typed in grazing leases, abandoned schoolhouses, ceremonial grounds. They always come up. This place didn't. I didn't tell anyone right away. Not because I wanted to hide it, but because this job teaches you to question your own perception before you question the system. I went back to my body cam file, scrubbed through. There I was, announcing the number into the audio. Same digits. Same rhythm. I slept badly that night. Not nightmares. Just that buzzing awareness you get when something is off but you can't explain why. I woke before dawn and drove back out, half expecting the trailer to be gone, like a bad cop story. It wasn't. Same windmill. Same dry creek. Same closed curtains. Only this time, when I parked, I noticed something I swear wasn't there before. A faded, "For sale by owner" sign nailed to the fence post. Weathered. Cracked. Like it had been there for months. I stood there longer than I should have, breath fogging in the cold, listening to the metal spin overhead. Then I unlocked the door again, because I had to be sure I hadn't imagined any of it. Inside, everything looked the same. Except the book on the table was closed. And I couldn't remember ever seeing it close. I stood in that tiny kitchen and realized I didn't trust the number in my notebook anymore. And that was the first time in my career that a missing person felt secondary to the feeling that the case itself had stepped off the record and left me holding an empty line. I didn't write anything additional in my notes that morning. I just stood there, listening to the heater kick on and off, watching the frost creep across the inside of the windows as the interior warmed for my presence alone. There's a stillness in empty houses that feels different from sleep. Sleep has breath in it. This place didn't. I reopened the book without thinking. I wanted to reassure myself that it hadn't always been closed. The page was dog-eared somewhere in the middle. A novel I didn't recognize. I flipped through it. Nothing highlighted. No notes in the margins. Just regular, silent narrative. I put it back exactly as it was, then took a photo, not of the page, but of the way it lay on the table. A record. Something external to the memory. Before leaving, I checked the bedroom closet. It wasn't full, but there were clothes. Boots still under the bed. Nothing screamed sudden departure. Even the toothbrush looked worn from daily use. I locked the door behind me and drove back the long, rutted road, tires crackling over frozen gravel. At the office, I didn't bring it up immediately. We were short-staffed and busy with an unrelated case near the river. It didn't feel right to walk in and say, "Hey, the system forgot a house." Instead, I tried to reopen the digital report. Still nothing. The field in the database where the call should have been was empty, not deleted, like it had never been created. I scanned the CAD card, uploaded the photo, attached the audio clip where I said the number aloud. If the system wanted to forget, it would have to ignore more than my handwriting. Mid-afternoon, my supervisor walked past my desk and paused when he saw the address on the form. He tapped the screen lightly. "That's not in our system," he said. "I know," I replied. "That's the problem." He nodded once, like I'd pointed out a loose hinge. "We must not have jurisdiction on that parcel. Trust land may not have been coded in." "That trailer's been there for years," I said. "We've responded out there before." He frowned, searching memory. "Have we?" I opened my mouth to answer, but nothing specific came up. I couldn't recall a single prior call, just a vague familiarity with the road, as if the place had always existed, but no one had ever needed us there until now. He shrugged and moved on. It wasn't negligence, just another oddity in a job full of them. And because there were other priorities, the missing person formed its own quiet gravity at the edge of my shift. Always there, never urgent enough for alarm. I printed a missing person sheet anyway. Name, date of birth, last known address. I kept it on my clipboard. I thought I'd call the out-of-state relative again the next day. That night, the relative called first. She sounded tired in the way you get when you've been waiting for a ring that doesn't come. When I explained who I was, she went silent for a few seconds. Then she said, slowly, "We thought he moved years ago." I listened. She explained they hadn't spoken in over 3 years. No argument, just drift. He'd sold some livestock, cut down expenses, stopped answering calls. They assumed he'd gone deeper into isolation. That's not uncommon here. Some people step sideways out of the social world and never step back. "Why now?" I asked. She hesitated. "We didn't call anyone. There are words that change temperature when you hear them. That sentence was one of them." I read the vague details of the initial dispatch note back to her. Anonymous concern. Possible welfare check. She repeated that no one in their family had called, and that they didn't know anyone else close enough who would have. I thanked her, promised to keep her updated. After I hung up, I stared at the phone for a long time. An anonymous call that didn't appear in the system. A case number that didn't exist. A missing person card that shouldn't have been generated. And now, the supposed caller denying involvement. I tried tracing the callback number from the dispatch entry. It was blank. The next day, I stopped by our records clerk's office. She's thorough in a way most agencies would envy. I asked if she could search for any older files tied to the address. Welfare checks, noise complaints, medical calls, anything. An hour later, she came back with a printout, a nearly empty page. "One listing," she said. "Property transfer. 21 years ago. No subsequent entries." "That can't be right," I said. She shrugged. "That's all we have." I thought of the boots under the bed, the toothbrush, the coffee cups, daily life. 2 decades of unrecorded existence didn't make sense, but I'd seen stranger gaps in bureaucracy. People fall through cracks all the time. Still, the thread tugged. I went back out on the third day. I don't know if it was duty or curiosity. Maybe both. At the turnoff, I slowed automatically, except the road didn't look quite the same. The fence line was there, the windmill, but the ruts in the dirt had softened, like no one had driven down in months. The trailer was exactly where it should be, but the "for sale" sign was gone. I parked, shut off the engine, and sat for a moment. The windmill creaked. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked and then went quiet. My radio hissed gently with open channel static. I knocked, announced, waited. The door opened easily this time. Inside, the house felt colder. The heater hadn't kicked on in days. The book was open again, but to a different page. Coffee cups remained. Bed still made. Boots in place. The difference was on the refrigerator. A magnet held a handwritten shopping list in neat block letters. Bread, coffee, salt, batteries. I didn't remember that from my first or second visit. I stood there trying to decide whether the absence belonged to me or the world. Did I overlook it? Did I forget? Or had the house filled itself in while I was gone? I photographed the list, wrote down each item, not because it mattered to the case, but because it grounded the moment in ink. I was halfway through leaving when I noticed the calendar. A generic wildlife print. Each square empty except one, last Tuesday, circled in ballpoint pen. No name, no note, just the circle. We hadn't received the anonymous call until Thursday. The drive back felt longer than before. The road seemed to stretch, like every landmark had taken half steps back from the shoulder. By the time I reached pavement, I'd convinced myself that these were small inconsistencies layered over daily fatigue. Our minds protect us from chaos by stitching reality together even when the seams show. At the office, I opened the database one more time. There was still no case number. But now there was no missing person entry either. Not even the placeholder I'd created the first night. My login history showed no edits, no deletions, no system messages. It was like the report had evaporated. I closed my eyes for a moment, then reopened them. My clipboard was empty. The missing person sheet, the printed paper, was gone. I didn't move right away. I let the hum of the lights and the soft ticking of the wall clock fill the space where panic would normally go. Panic doesn't help in this job. Routine does. So I reached slowly for my notebook instead. The page where I'd written the case number was blank. Not erased. Just blank. And for the first time in 12 years, I didn't trust the difference between what I carried in my head and what the world allowed to remain written down. I didn't report the blank page to anyone. There's an unspoken rule in law enforcement. You don't bring forward questions that make you sound unfit for duty unless you're certain the problem is real. And certainty is a fragile thing. So I did what professionals do. I recreated the report from memory as best I could. Date, time, location, observations. I saved it, printed it, and filed the paper copy myself. Then I waited. 2 days passed. Calls came in. A domestic dispute. A traffic stop gone sideways. A stranded motorist. Work that fills the calendar and gives the illusion of continuity. I slept. I ate. I didn't mention the case unless necessary. But every time I logged into the system, I checked. The report remained there until it didn't. On the morning of the third day, I opened the database and found the slot empty again. My paper copy was gone as well. Not misplaced. Gone. The entire file holder in the cabinet looked as though it had never been used. So I walked down the hall to records. Did you move any of my files? I asked the clerk. She shook her head. Not unless you requested it. I didn't press. I wasn't sure what I would even request. The rational explanation was human error. Papers get misfiled. Databases glitch. Memory bends. That's what I told myself as I walked back to my office. But the hallway felt longer than usual, and every fluorescent tube hummed with a faint, flickering insistence. Around noon, dispatch radioed me. Possible trespass complaint, they said. Caller reports unfamiliar vehicle parked along the creek bed near County Line Road. No description on the occupants. County Line Road wasn't far from the missing man's property. I acknowledged, turned the SUV toward the highway, and felt a quiet tightening in my chest that I didn't name. When I arrived, there was no vehicle. Just tire marks in the frost, curving down toward the creek like a signature trailing off. I followed them on foot until the earth softened under my boots. In the brittle grass near the bank, I saw a second set of impressions. Boots, size similar to the pair I'd seen beneath the bed. No prints leading back out. The water was shallow and slow. Nothing caught on the reeds. No signs of a fall. I stood there listening, letting the silence speak until it had nothing else to say. I logged the location, took photos, entered the data, but this time I copied everything by hand into a separate notebook I kept at home. Not because I expected the system to erase it, but because I no longer trusted the idea that it wouldn't. Later that afternoon, a community member stopped by the station with a question about a permit. As we wrapped up, he mentioned, casually, that he'd heard we were looking for someone who went missing. "Who told you that?" I asked. He shrugged. "People talk. What have they been saying?" "That he came back," he said. I blinked. "Who came back?" "The guy out by the creek," he said, like it was obvious. "Bought feed last week from the co-op." "What day?" "Tuesday." I thanked him and wrote it down, though I didn't need to. Tuesday again. On my break, I drove to the co-op. The owner is meticulous about receipts. I asked if anyone matching the man's description had been in. He pulled up the register history, scanned, frowned. "Nothing," he said. "Not this month. No cash sales. Everything logs," he said. "Even cash." We both stared at the monitor for a moment, as if an answer might appear in the margins. On my way out, he stopped me. "You okay?" he asked. "Yeah," I lied, because the truth would have sounded like a question. That evening, I returned once more to the trailer. Dusk had sunk into the land like a slow tide. The sky faded from slate to near black without bothering to change colors in between. I parked in the same place as always, stepped out, and listened. No generator. No radio. No dog barking. Nothing. The front door was locked. I let myself in. Inside, the book was gone. Not moved. Gone. The coffee cups were clean and turned upside down on a towel beside the sink. The bed remained made. The boots, however, were missing from under it. I stood in the doorway of the bedroom, recording the details aloud like a training exercise. Interior appears altered. Possible return by resident. No forced entry. My voice sounded calm enough, but there was a hollowness to it, as though it belonged to someone slightly behind my shoulder. I backed out, closed the door, locked it, and sat on the front step for a while. The cold traveled easily through the wood. I watched my breath drift and vanish. I thought about how often we measure existence by record keeping. If the file goes missing, the event becomes a rumor. If no one remembers the rumor, the event becomes nothing at all. Eventually, I walked the property line with my flashlight. The beam slid across sage, rusted wire, and frozen mud. Near the back fence, something caught the light, a scrap of paper pinned beneath a rock. I knelt. It was a page torn from a notebook. On it, carefully written in the same block letters as the refrigerator list, was a single line. Case no. The blank stretched across the page like a wound no one had stitched. I didn't touch it at first. I just stared, breathing slow, registering the texture of the paper, the way the ink had bled slightly where the tip rested. Then I bagged it, labeled it, and placed it in my jacket pocket. Not in the cruiser, not in the station evidence locker. Some irrational part of me believed that if I handed it over to the system, it would vanish like everything else. Driving back, the radio remained stubbornly silent. Even dispatch chatter felt thinner, farther away. The dome light inside the SUV flickered once when I hit a rut, then steadied. The world has subtle ways of reminding you how little control you truly have. At home that night, I laid the evidence bag on the table and stared at it while the kettle boiled. Steam fogged the window above the sink. Outside, the winter night pressed close. I took out my off-duty notebook, the one the job doesn't own, and rewrote everything again. Dates, times, mile markers, the description of the page. I didn't trust a single copy to stand alone anymore. When I finished, I checked the page in the bag again. The line was still blank. I don't know what answer I expected. Maybe I just needed to confirm that reality hadn't shifted while my back was turned. I slept lightly. In the morning, I reached for the notebook before I checked my phone, as if the order mattered. The entries were there. My handwriting. The facts intact. But the evidence bag on the table was empty. I searched the apartment, methodically, like a warrantless sweep. Under the sink. Inside the fridge. Between couch cushions. The rational part of my mind narrated, "You misplaced it. You were tired. You're projecting." The rest of me said nothing at all. I drove to work earlier than usual, the roads quiet, the sky colorless. The building unlocked with the usual metallic click. The desk lamp hummed when I switched it on. I logged in. No case number. No missing person. No record of any call to the trailer on County Line Road. Just the same indifferent interface, waiting for the next routine entry, as if the world had turned the page without me. And for the first time, I wondered, calmly, clinically, whether I was the only place the case still existed. I don't dramatize what happened next. I went to work. I handled calls. I filed reports that stayed filed. I drank burnt coffee from the break room pot. The world went on behaving as expected in every way but one, and that single exception became a quiet room in the back of my mind that I couldn't stop walking past. Late that week, I decided to visit the trailer again, not as a search, not as an investigation, just as a presence. Sometimes being seen by law enforcement discourages bad outcomes. That was the reason I would have written in a report, if the report had been allowed to exist. The drive out there had begun to feel circular. Same mile markers. Same curve in the road where the ditch widened. Same cattle gate with faded paint. Memory should make repetition familiar. Instead, it began to feel rehearsed, like I was walking through lines someone else had written. When I arrived, dusk had already begun to swallow what little light the sky had left. The windmill spun with a slow, metallic complaint. I parked, stepped out, and immediately noticed tracks in the soft edge of the road. Fresh. A single vehicle. Narrow tread. Probably a small pickup. They led to the trailer and disappeared beside it. I called out before approaching. It's habit, but it also gives the land a chance to answer. Nothing did. The front door was locked. The window over the sink glowed faintly with reflected sky, no light inside. I circled to the back. That's when I saw it. A small fire ring, new, the stones not yet sunken into the dirt, sat near the creek bank. In the ash were charred fragments of paper. Not logs, not letters, just shredded, burned sheets. I crouched and sifted gently with a gloved hand. Most of it had been reduced to lacework ash. But one fragment survived, a corner of a page, with a straight ruled line and the faint ghost of block letters at the edge. I couldn't make out the words. I didn't need to. Someone had been destroying records. Maybe their own. Maybe mine. I placed the fragment in an evidence envelope I'd brought for reasons I hadn't admitted to myself. Then I walked slowly back to the trailer and stood at the door a long time before unlocking it. Inside, it smelled faintly of wood smoke, the kind that clings to clothes and hair. The book had not returned. The coffee cups were gone from the towel. The bedspread was rumpled, as if someone had sat on it briefly and stood back up. On the kitchen table lay a page from a spiral notebook. It wasn't torn. It wasn't burned. It was blank except for the date written at the top. That day's date, in the same careful block letters I'd seen before. I stared at it, then at the chair pulled slightly away from the table, then at the way the dust on the floor showed a faint boot-marked path between the door and the stove. I spoke aloud without meaning to, just to anchor the moment to sound. I was here. My voice sounded smaller than the room. I photographed the page, bagged it, sat in the chair for a minute because it felt like leaving immediately would turn me into the one who didn't belong. I thought about what it means to exist only where someone has written you down. Tribal enrollment rolls, census data, police reports, the shape of a life cut into paper. If you burn the paper, does the life shrink around the edges to match? When I left, I paused at the fire ring again. The ashes fluttered slightly in the breeze, disintegrating into the cold air as if they'd been waiting for permission. That night, I spoke to my supervisor. I didn't tell him about missing reports and blank pages. I kept it grounded. There's a resident on County Line Road who may be coming and going without contact, I said. I'm concerned about his well-being. He nodded. Said we'd do a formal welfare follow-up with another officer present. That was procedure. That was safe. That meant I wouldn't be the only witness. The next afternoon, we drove out together. The road was the same. The fence was the same. The windmill creaked. But where the trailer should have been, there was only bare earth and a patch of flattened weeds. My supervisor and I stood there, side by side, looking at the same empty space. Are you sure this is the spot? He asked. His tone wasn't accusatory, just practical. I scanned the horizon, locating landmarks I recognized. The creek bend, the cottonwood, the low ridge to the north. My certainty tightened like a knot. Yes, I said. He walked the perimeter, boots crunching frost. There were no fresh tire ruts, no disturbed soil, no drag marks, just absence, old enough that the ground had made its peace with it. You probably marked the wrong location, he said eventually. Not dismissive, not unkind, just filing the observation where it fit. I didn't argue. There's no way to win a disagreement with a void. We left after documenting nothing. Back at the office, I tried something I hadn't before. I searched the property records again. This time, there was no transfer 21 years ago. Just a gap, blank space where the line had once been. I sat with that for a while. I pulled out my off-duty notebook, the one I trusted, and reread my entries slowly. Names, dates, observations, evidence, my handwriting, my ink. It existed there, only there. I called the relative again that evening. She answered quicker this time. I wanted to update you, I said, carefully. We're still trying to verify your brother's current address. There was a pause. My brother, she said. I felt the temperature of the call drop a degree. Yes, I said. I named him. She took a breath. I don't have a brother, she replied. I didn't respond immediately. I let silence do the work of revealing truth or error. Sometimes people backfill their words. She didn't. I think you have the wrong number, she added gently. Then she hung up. I looked at my phone history. The number was the same one I'd written down earlier that week. The same one attached to the blank dispatch record. The same one that now belonged to no one. That night, I went for a walk through town. The air was brittle with cold. A stray dog watched me from the corner before padding away. Porch lights glowed like small islands in the dark. I thought about how many lives on the reservation never make it fully into the record. People born at home. People buried without paperwork. Elders whose stories are held in memory rather than ink. There's a quiet dignity in that, but also a danger. Because if no one remembers you, the world grows comfortable with your absence. I slept poorly again. I dreamed, if you can call it that, of driving the same road in widening circles, the landmarks repeating, the night never quite ending. The next morning, I opened my notebook. The entries were still there, but the name was gone. Not crossed out. Not erased. Just absence where the letters had once been. I felt no fear. Just a deep, measured unease, like standing in shallow water and feeling the current shift around your legs, carrying silt away until the ground changes shape beneath your feet. I closed the notebook carefully. I went to work. I logged into the system. A new call had come in overnight. Welfare check. County Line Road. Anonymous caller. Case number assigned. And for a long time, I just stared at the screen, trying to decide whether I was recognizing the pattern or becoming part of it. I accepted the call, not because I wanted to confirm anything supernatural or extraordinary. I don't believe in labeling something just because I don't understand it, but because ignoring it would have meant stepping away from my duty. And if there was anything left that anchored me, it was the structure of the job. I acknowledged the dispatch, wrote the case number down in my notebook, a reflex I couldn't unlearn, and headed out. The road felt familiar in a way that wasn't comforting anymore. Not déjà vu. More like muscle memory wearing thin. The sky was heavy with unfallen snow that never quite committed. The wind dragged a low, steady sound across the plains, as if the land itself was clearing its throat. My headlights washed over the sagebrush, catching thin frost crystals on every stem. The world looked paused, like a video buffering. When I turned onto County Line Road, I didn't look for the trailer. I looked for absence. And absence was what I found. The same bare patch. The same flattened weeds. The same windmill, working without purpose. There were newer tire tracks this time, not mine, pressed into the muddy edge where the frost had thawed and refrozen. They ended where the front steps of the trailer should have been. I got out slowly and let the silence develop. There's a difference between silence that's empty and silence that's listening. This felt like the latter. I radioed that I was on scene, not because I expected backup, but because I wanted a timestamp somewhere outside my own notebook. I walked the perimeter the way they teach you. Slow, methodical, eyes tracing edges. No trash. No discarded belongings. No footprints except my own and those old tire marks. If anyone had been here recently, the land had already begun erasing their handwriting. I stood where the kitchen table would have been and looked out toward the creek, imagining the angle of the window over the sink. I couldn't explain why that mattered, but it did. It grounded the memory to geography instead of imagination. I spoke aloud again, the way I had before. Tribal police. If anyone's here, I'm not here to hurt you. The wind answered by shifting slightly, rattling the dry stems against each other. I don't talk to myself as a rule, but sometimes you have to fill the space with your own voice just to remind yourself you exist in it. I didn't find anything. Not the blank page. Not the handwritten list. Not the burned fragments. Just a place shaped like a memory someone had set down and walked away from. Back at the station, I filed my notes. Carefully, fully, with every detail I could ground in physical observation. I attached photographs of empty land. I included a GPS coordinate, triple-checked. I uploaded the audio log from the radio. Then I waited. By morning, the report hadn't been deleted. That surprised me more than if it had. I read it again at my desk, line by line, until the routine of it steadied me. A colleague stopped by and asked if I was working the new welfare case out by county line. I said yes. He nodded like it was unremarkable and moved on. That small reaction grounded me more than any explanation could have. It meant I wasn't dreaming this alone. Later that day, I drove out with him. Not to prove anything, just to confirm the location, as procedure would dictate when multiple calls come into the same area. We arrived in the dusty afternoon light, the sky washed pale. He leaned on the hood of the SUV and looked around. "Not much out here," he said. "No," I agreed. He pointed toward the empty patch. "That where the residence was supposed to be?" "Yeah." He nodded, like that made sense. No disbelief. No confusion. Just a quiet acceptance that sometimes addresses stop corresponding to structures. We didn't linger. There was nothing to linger over. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table with my notebook open, reading my own handwriting in the same calm way I would read a stranger's report. I wanted to see if anything felt embellished, if any sentence reached beyond what I had actually seen. It didn't. Everything was factual, just incomplete. Around 10, my phone buzzed. Unknown number. I answered. There was a moment of nothing, not dead air, not static. Just the subtle sound of someone on the other end deciding whether to speak. Then a man's voice, quiet, controlled. "Did you come to my place?" The tone wasn't angry, just weary. I asked his name. He said it. The same name that no longer existed in my notebook. Hearing it spoken aloud, not by me, did something subtle to my balance, as if the floor had shifted half an inch. "Yes," I said evenly. "I conducted a welfare check." He breathed out slowly. I figured. Silence stretched. I didn't rush to fill it. "You don't have to keep checking," he said after a while. "I'm fine." "I'm glad to hear that," I replied. "But we received a call." "I know," he said. "I didn't make it. Do you know who did?" Silence again. Then, quietly, "Sometimes people notice when you stop existing on paper." That sentence lodged in me like a splinter. "Where are you now?" I asked. He paused, and I could almost hear him looking around. "Home," he said. His voice held no uncertainty, no irony, just calm. The line clicked. Call ended. I saved the number. Tried calling back. Disconnected. I wrote everything down, verbatim, before I allowed meaning to creep in. The next day, I requested phone company assistance through official channels. The number did not trace to any subscriber. It had no call history before that moment. No record after. That afternoon, another officer mentioned something strange. In the parking lot, leaning against the SUV, voices low the way people get when they're not ready to assign meaning. He said he'd heard the name too, once years ago, attached to a case that had never fully formed. A missing livestock complaint with no follow-up. A medical call where EMS found nothing. The kind of small, half-remembered occurrences that never quite grow into real reports. We stood there in the pale winter light, two professionals talking about administrative fragments like they were evidence. And then we both stopped. Because there's a point where naming a thing gives it structure, and neither of us wanted to be the one who did that. That night, I didn't dream. I just lay awake listening to the sound of the building. Pipes knocking, neighbors moving, wind nudging the eaves, and I thought about the man's voice. Calm. Ordinary. Present. But anchored nowhere. The next morning, I opened the system. The new case number was gone. My report, the second, carefully reconstructed one, gone. The dispatch entry, gone. Even the log of the welfare call, gone. And the IT audit trail, blank. I sat there quietly, hands folded, and realized something with a level of calm that surprised me. It wasn't just that the case didn't exist. It was that it had never been allowed to. The only place it lived now was in the thin graphite of my off-duty notebook, and in me. So I wrote another line beneath the others. Slow, deliberate, the way you steady yourself on a handrail going down a dark stairwell. I acknowledge that I may be the last remaining witness to an event that no longer exists in any official system. I didn't write that for drama. I wrote it because it was true. And because if someone ever reads these pages after I'm gone, I want them to know one thing. I did not imagine this. I simply refused to forget. The thing about law enforcement is that reality is usually verifiable. You can measure skid marks. You can document injuries. You can locate witnesses. Even when stories conflict, there's a physical world underneath that doesn't care who's telling it. When that foundation wavers, even slightly, you learn to hold very still, the way you would if the ice beneath your feet began to sound hollow. So I went back to work. I handled calls. I wrote reports. I sat in briefing, sipping burnt coffee and listening to the minor weather complaints that fill the space between sadder conversations. I drove the same roads I'd always driven. Outwardly, nothing changed. Inwardly, one fact remained. I was carrying around a case that had no legal mass. I didn't talk about it anymore. Not because of fear, but because language itself felt unstable around it. Every word I might use seemed too heavy for something that slipped so easily out of records. Instead, I stayed quiet and listened more carefully than usual. People talk. They always do. At first, the mentions were casual. Someone would reference, "that guy who lives out by the creek." Another would nod, not quite remembering the name. A store clerk would say, "I used to see him every couple months." A ranch hand mentioned once giving a ride to someone who sounded like him. Years ago, maybe longer. None of them could anchor their memory to a date. No one had saved a receipt. I began to keep a separate section of my notebook labeled simply, "Unverified Recollections." Underneath, I logged each conversation. Location. Time. Summary. Not to build a case. There was no case to build. But to prove to myself that the memory of this man wasn't confined solely to me. But memory is a treacherous witness. Ask someone the same question 3 days later and the details shift. Not maliciously, just naturally. Our minds smooth the rough edges. That's what I told myself. One night, nearing the end of my shift, I took the long route back through the reservation roads. The sky had cleared, and the stars were sharp enough to feel intrusive. The temperature had dropped, and the road glittered with a thin skin of ice. I slowed to a cautious crawl. That's when I saw headlights cresting a hill ahead, an older truck by the silhouette. It approached, passed, and continued on without slowing. I don't know what made me glance in the mirror. Maybe instinct. Maybe nothing. But when I did, the road behind me was empty. No taillights. No vehicle. Just the dim silver of frost-reflecting starlight. I pulled over, stepped out, and listened. The cold was deep enough that sound traveled farther. I should have been able to hear the engine fading. There was nothing. I didn't log that. Some details are less helpful on paper than they are in memory. A few days later, while finishing paperwork at the station after dark, the records clerk knocked on my doorframe. "You requested older property maps," she asked. I did. She handed me a manila folder. Inside were survey plots going back decades. Parcels like jigsaw pieces in faded ink. I traced the grid with a pen, looking for the familiar bend in the creek. There was a parcel there. Rectangular. Unlabeled. Unnumbered. Just an empty shape. Was this one never assigned? I asked, tapping it. She leaned in. That's odd, she murmured. It should at least have a code. It doesn't. She shook her head. Not here. We both stared at the blank space for a few seconds longer than necessary. Then she straightened, said she'd check another system, and left me with the quiet. I slid the map into my notebook, folded carefully, pressed flat. That night, on my way home, I took a detour, not all the way to County Line Road, just close enough to feel the shape of absence beyond the dark horizon. The windmill was probably still there, complaining to no one. I slept. Sometime not long before dawn, my phone vibrated on the nightstand. Unknown number again. I answered before I was fully awake. I appreciate you checking, the same calm voice said. But you don't have to keep writing things down. I sat up slowly, pulse steady, voice even. That's part of my job, I said. A soft breath through the receiver. Not annoyance. Not amusement. Just weariness. Jobs end, he said. Paper ends. Then, after a pause, sometimes the only thing left is whether someone remembers you at all. The line went silent before I could respond. I didn't bother trying to redial. I wrote the words down, not because I wanted to keep them, but because I needed to witness that they had existed at least once in ink. That morning, briefing ran long. We discussed budgets, staffing shortages, training schedules, all the regular realities that remind you the world still functions according to gravity. Afterward, my supervisor asked me to follow him into his office. He closed the door. "Are you doing okay?" he asked. I answered truthfully, "I think so." He nodded. "We've had some inconsistencies in the system lately," he said carefully. "Reports appearing and disappearing. Not just yours." I didn't react, just listened. "We're looking into it," he added. "In the meantime, keep documenting. Paper and digital." That small acknowledgement, without saying what either of us already knew, steadied something inside me. The world may not have been reliable, but at least my perception of it wasn't entirely solitary. Over the next week, the calls slowed. Winter does that. People stay indoors. Trouble curls up and sleeps until spring. The roads stay empty except for the occasional truck and the quiet persistence of patrol vehicles. One night near the end of my shift, I saw a figure walking along the shoulder of the highway. Reflective clothing absent. No flashlight. Just slow, careful steps. I pulled over, rolled down the window. "You all right?" I asked. He nodded without looking up. The gesture was small, contained, familiar in a way that didn't feel like recognition, just inevitability. "Need a ride somewhere?" I asked. He stopped walking, turned slightly, not enough for me to see his face clearly. The shadow under the brim of his hat swallowed the details. "I'm already home," he said. Then he stepped off the shoulder and continued into the darkness, parallel to the road, moving toward nothing. I didn't follow. Some situations only exist as long as you give them your attention. Others persist whether you turn your head or not. The hard part is learning to tell the difference. When I got back into the SUV, the radio crackled. "Unit 212, dispatch said. Confirming your status?" I looked down at the MDT. There was a new entry. Welfare check. County Line Road. Anonymous caller. Same wording. New case number. I wrote it down. Not out of habit, but because, for reasons I couldn't articulate, I had started to feel that these numbers weren't assignments anymore. They were reminders. And every time I saw one, it felt less like a beginning, and more like a return. I've learned that there are kinds of work you can put down at the end of a shift, and kinds that begin to follow you home, sitting quietly in your living room long after the radio has gone silent. This fell into the second category. Not a burden. Not paranoia. Just a constant awareness, like a low-grade ringing in the ears that only becomes obvious when the world grows still. I didn't tell anyone about the man on the roadside. I logged the stop as a welfare check. Subject refused assistance. Ambulated independently. The sentence sat on the screen like a thin bridge over deep water. Accurate. Incomplete. The way most reports are, if you're honest. Another week passed. Calls came and went. A broken window at the school, a drunk who'd fallen asleep in his car, a snowplow that slid into a ditch. Life continued with its usual unremarkable dramas. I kept expecting the case to dissolve completely from my thoughts, the way most unresolved matters eventually fade. It didn't. Instead, it settled into the landscape of my mind the same way the hills had. Something that simply was, neither demanding nor retreating. A quiet fact. One afternoon, while I was parked near the cliffs overlooking the river, an elder approached my vehicle. She moved slowly, but with intention. I rolled down the window. "You're the one who keeps going out to the creek," she said. Her tone wasn't accusatory, just observant. "Yes, ma'am," I said. She nodded to herself, as if confirming something unspoken. For a moment, she just looked out at the river. The ice shifted in slow plates along the current, whispering against itself. "Be careful how much of your life you give to the things that don't stay," she said quietly. Then she walked away. I didn't ask how she knew. Some knowledge doesn't come from paperwork. It travels along quieter paths. That evening, back at the station, the records clerk stopped by my desk again. "I found something," she said. She held out a photocopy, a fragment from an older ledger, the type written before we digitized our archives. There was a handwritten notation, faint but legible. A name, the same name, followed by a short line of text. Residence verified. No further action. No date. No case number. No signature. Just that. "Where'd you find this?" I asked. "In a box mislabeled as vehicle registrations," she said, "under a stack of blank forms." "Do you know who wrote it?" She shook her head. Different hand than the usual clerk's. "Looks careful." I thanked her and made a copy for myself, one that I folded and slid into my notebook, because at that point I no longer trusted single points of preservation. That night, I couldn't sleep. Not restlessness, not fear, just a sense of being watched, not by a person, but by the story itself, waiting to see whether I'd let it settle or keep stirring it up. Near midnight, I dressed, grabbed my coat, and drove without announcing my destination. The windmill found me before the road did, that slow metallic turning that feels less like sound and more like a thought you can't quite finish. When I reached the creek, I parked, turned off the engine, and just listened. The land was empty. The trailer was gone. The earth looked untouched. I stepped out and walked to the patch of ground where the front steps should have been. Frost crackled beneath my boots, loud in the stillness. I knelt and placed my palm flat on the frozen dirt. Cold, solid, unremarkable. "I acknowledge your existence," I said, not to a person, but to the memory. "And I will continue to." My voice disappeared into the night without echo. I don't know how long I stayed there. Time on the reservation doesn't flow the way people think it does. It spreads. Eventually, muscle memory brought me back to the SUV. I sat behind the wheel, key in the ignition, hand resting there like I'd paused halfway into a decision. That's when the radio clicked. No call sign. No dispatch. Just the open channel, carrying faint atmosphere like a seashell. Then a voice. Not the same as the man who'd called me. This one was younger. Uneasy. "Unit 212. Copy?" I lifted the mic. "Go ahead." Could you assist on a welfare check? The dispatcher asked. Residence unknown. Caller disconnected before providing location. They just said, by the creek. I stared at the microphone. Do you have a case number? I asked. There was a pause. Then, carefully, yes. She read it. I wrote it down. Just numbers. Ink on paper. A tether. Copy, I said. But I didn't drive anywhere. I was already there. I stepped out again, flashlight cutting a pale tunnel through the dark. The air held that metallic cold you taste at the back of your throat. My breath drifted slowly up and away. Tribal police, I called out calmly. If you can hear me, I'm here. The night absorbed the words. For a long time, nothing happened. Then, faint, almost not there, I heard the sound of footsteps in the frosted weeds. Slow, even, approaching, but never arriving. I didn't raise my light. I didn't reach for my weapon. I just stood there, spine straight, heart steady, acknowledging that there are moments when truth exists only in the overlap between perception and record, and that sometimes we are all that overlap has. Eventually, the sound faded. The windmill creaked. The sky held its silence. I returned to the SUV, wrote the time down, closed the notebook, and sat with my hands resting on the steering wheel, feeling the small tremor of the engine as it idled, the one machine in all that emptiness insisting on being real. Back at the station, I filed the report. I made 3 copies. 1 went to records. 1 stayed on my desk. 1 went home with me. The next morning, the report was gone from the system again. The copy on my desk, gone. The one in records, gone. But the one in my notebook remained. And that was when I understood something quietly devastating. The world was not erasing the case. It was simply refusing to acknowledge it had ever been written. For reasons I will never know. That day, I stopped trying to force the story into systems that rejected it. I kept doing my job. I kept writing everything down. But I stopped expecting the world to agree with me. Weeks passed. Winter deepened. Calls rose and fell. And sometimes, at odd hours, a case number would appear on the screen. Welfare check. County Line Road. Anonymous caller. I would write it down, not as an assignment, but as confirmation that somewhere, on the edge of the record, a life was still insisting on being remembered, and that, for now at least, I was still here to do it. There's a saying on the reservation that I didn't fully understand until recently. Some things aren't meant to be written down, that's why they stay. I used to think it meant privacy, boundaries. Now I wonder if it also refers to a kind of gravity, the way certain stories refuse ink the same way the body rejects a splinter. I kept working. I kept responding to normal calls. I kept being the quiet, calm presence people expect when they dial a number for help. But part of me had begun to live in the margins, always aware of that parcel by the creek, that missing house-shaped absence, that name which arrived only in voices and then evaporated again. And the case numbers, always new, always the same. One evening, we were assisting county deputies at a traffic checkpoint. Routine, license, registration, small talk. Most drivers were patient. A few weren't. Nothing unusual. I handled the paperwork, handed back IDs, nodded people on. Then a truck rolled forward, older model, well-maintained, the sort farmers prize for reliability rather than looks. The driver lowered the window. A middle-aged man. Calm eyes. Weathered face. Evening, I said. He nodded once. Evening, officer. I asked for identification. He reached for his wallet, slow, deliberate, and slid a card across. I took it, held it. Read the name. It was the name. Exactly as I remembered it. The letters sat on the plastic like they belonged there. I kept my voice level. "Thank you." He waited patiently while I stepped back to the cruiser and keyed the name into the system. No record found. Not as a driver. Not as a resident. Not as a person. I checked the number. No record. I returned to the truck. "Where are you headed tonight?" I asked. "Home," he said. The word didn't sound evasive, just complete. "Where's home?" I asked. He thought for a moment, as if searching for the clearest phrasing. "By the creek," he said. My pen hovered over the pad. I could have asked him to step out. I could have detained him until we resolved the identity discrepancy. But he wasn't intoxicated. He wasn't aggressive. His paperwork, non-existent or not, didn't change the fact that he was driving safely and calmly. So I handed the license back. "Drive carefully," I said. He nodded once. Then he drove away. I watched the taillights shrink into the dark, then disappear around a bend. When I entered the stop into the system, his name auto-corrected into something else. A near match. Similar letters, different order. A real person who lived 2 towns over and bore no resemblance to the man I'd just spoken to. I deleted the entry, not to hide anything, but because the wrong name didn't belong to the truth. Later that night, while I sat at my kitchen table updating my notebook, I noticed something I hadn't before. The edges of the pages were beginning to curl slightly from repeated handling. Finger oils. Air. Time. Physical proof that whatever I wrote here existed in a way the system could not erase without touching the object itself. That brought a strange kind of peace. Not understanding. Just peace. A few mornings later, during shift change, an officer from day tour approached me. "Hey," he said. "We got another welfare check ping last night. County line." I nodded. He lowered his voice. "Dispatch can't find the audio or the call log, but the CAD showed it for a minute. Then it disappeared." He stared at me like he was trying to decide whether we were allowed to acknowledge the shape of the thing between us. "Did you respond?" I asked. He shook his head. It cleared itself before we could. We both accepted that without naming it further. Around that time, I started keeping track of something else. The weather. Because each time the case surfaced, the air felt the same. Heavy, unmoving, as though even the wind was listening. Snow that never fully committed. Frost like a thin memory across the dirt. The world paused at the edge of a sentence. One night, after a long shift filled with nothing memorable, I went for a drive. Not to the creek, not to any particular place. Just driving. The road unfolded like ribbon beneath my headlights. The stars had gone quiet behind a clouded sky. I turned the radio down to a hush. Then I spoke aloud, not to anyone specific. "If you want to be remembered," I said, "you already are." The words surprised me. I'm a practical person. I don't make promises lightly. But this wasn't a promise. It was an observation. The case existed. If only here, in the narrow band of my perception and the scratched graphite of a notebook, it still existed. The next day, something shifted. I arrived at the station to find an envelope on my desk. No return address. No postmark. Just my name. Inside was a single photograph, printed on older matte paper. A trailer. Familiar. Windmill in the background. Snow along the creek. Camera angle slightly different than mine. Winter light low and blue. On the back, in neat block letters. Residence verified. No further action. Same wording as the ledger fragment. No name. No date. No case number. Just the verdict. I brought it to records. She hadn't seen it before. I asked if anyone else had received similar envelopes. She said no. We scanned it into the system, saved copies, filed the original in climate-controlled storage. For the first time, the case had mass. A physical object that wasn't mine alone. The next morning, the digital scan was gone, but the photograph remained, locked in a drawer behind 2 keys. I checked every few days. It stayed. Time moved like winter water, slow, deliberate. Eventually, the welfare calls stopped. Not suddenly, just faded. Weeks went by with no anonymous alerts, no case numbers, no whispers about someone living by the creek. The road thawed. The sagebrush loosened its winter grip. Life resumed its usual seasonal rhythm. I still drove past the turnoff sometimes, but I didn't stop. Not out of fear, just respect. And then one quiet afternoon, while I was refueling the SUV, the records clerk stepped outside, coat pulled tight against the wind. "You should see this," she said. We went back inside. On her desk lay the same photograph, but the back had changed. The sentence was gone, not crossed out, not rewritten, just blank paper. I turned it over again. The image was still there. The trailer, the creek, the windmill, proof of presence, but stripped of every word that tried to define it. We looked at each other. Neither of us spoke. That evening, I added one more line to my notebook. Not about the case, not about the man, not even about the trailer. Just this. Sometimes, the only record is the witness. And if that sounds dramatic, it isn't. It's the calmest truth I know. Because the world is full of things that don't fit easily into ledgers and databases and neatly typed reports. Lives that pass in and out of documentation like breath on a cold window. Some stay, some fade, some hover in that quiet space between the two. I don't chase the case anymore. I don't try to force it into systems that reject it. But I also don't forget. And if another welfare check appears on my screen, anonymous caller, County Line Road, I will write the number down. I will acknowledge it. Not because I think I'm saving anyone, but because I believe, quietly, firmly, that it matters when we bear witness, even if the world refuses to remember with us. Especially then. Spring came slowly that year, like a shy visitor unsure whether they were welcome. Snow retreated in thin, exhausted lines along the ditch banks. Mud replaced frost. Birds returned in cautious numbers. Life resumed its usual forward motion, the kind that erases most winters cleanly enough that you only remember the weight of them when you're tired. The case, if that's what it was, didn't end. It simply went quiet. I kept working. I kept writing. I kept showing up to calls where the world behaved predictably. Arguments, traffic collisions, lost livestock, medical assists. All grounded. All verifiable. You begin to appreciate the solidity of ordinary problems when you've brushed against something that refuses to leave footprints. But nothing truly disappears. It just moves inward. Every now and then, I would catch sight of the windmill from the highway, a pale shape against the sky, and feel a small shift in my chest, like remembering a dream I wasn't sure I'd had. I never turned down the road unless there was a call. Respect can look like distance, too. The photograph stayed locked in records. My notebook continued to fill, not only with patrol notes, but with something else. Observations. Fragments. A list of things that never made it into official systems, but still mattered because someone had lived them. Around that time, a new recruit joined our department. Young, smart, serious in the way new officers often are, carrying the job like an oath they haven't learned to set down yet. We rode together sometimes. I didn't mention the case, not because I wanted to hide it, but because I didn't want to hand them something I hadn't yet placed properly myself. One night on patrol, We pulled onto an overlook to drink coffee and watch the slow shimmer of the river under moonlight. It was quiet for a while. Then, without looking at me, the recruit said, "Do you ever feel like some calls stay with you longer than they should?" Their tone wasn't dramatic, just curious, honest. "Yes," I said. They nodded, satisfied with that, and we didn't talk about it further. A few days later, I was at the station when the records clerk waved me over. "You should see this," she said again, the same way she had with the photograph. She turned her monitor so I could see the screen. There it was. A case number. Attached to a welfare check. County Line Road. Anonymous caller. Timestamp. 10 minutes earlier. And beneath it, for the first time, resolved. No further action. Someone had closed the call. I blinked. Who handled it? I asked. She shook her head. System says it auto-closed. That doesn't happen. Not here. Not for welfare checks. Not for anything. But there it was. Logged. Contained. Tidy in a way that felt profoundly wrong. I drove out after shift without telling anyone. Not full lights. Not urgency. Just a quiet, steady drive through the lengthening evening. The windmill was still there. The creek had thawed into a slow, reflective line of water. The ground where the trailer should have been looked the same as always. Unremarkable, like memory that's been smoothed flat by weather. But there was something new. A single post in the ground. Weathered wood. No sign. No writing. Just a post. Standing there. Claiming nothing. Marking everything. I walked up to it, touched the worn surface with my gloved hand. It felt real. Cold. Solid. A fact. Someone had put it there. But there were no tire tracks. No boot prints. No sign of disturbance beyond the post itself. I circled the area once. Twice. Slowly. Methodical. Not chasing an answer. Just acknowledging the space. The windmill creaked. The creek whispered. The world remained otherwise intact. I didn't talk aloud this time. I didn't write right away. I just stood there until the last usable light drained from the sky and the shadows grew honest. On the way back, my radio crackled with routine calls. I took one, handled it, wrote the report. The day folded itself properly again. That night, I added a new page to my notebook. Not the usual patrol log, just a statement. Simple, steady, careful. On this date, physical evidence appeared marking the site previously described. Purpose unknown. Interpretation withheld. I underlined interpretation withheld, not for effect, but as a reminder. Not everything needs to be explained. Sometimes the most honest sentence in the world is, "I don't know." Days passed. Then weeks. The recruit settled into the job. The records clerk kept her meticulous habits. My supervisor remained pragmatic. The world kept doing what it does best. Moving on. One late afternoon, storm clouds dragged shadows across the plains. I was finishing paperwork when dispatch called me. "Unit 212, they said. "We received a voicemail." "Go ahead," I replied. "It's garbled," they said, "but the caller mentioned your name. And the creek." I closed my eyes briefly. "Save the audio," I said. "I'll come by." The voicemail was short, gravelly, distorted by wind or distance. But it contained one sentence I recognized, even through the noise. "Thank you for remembering." No name, no request, just that. A courtesy, maybe, or a farewell. I asked dispatch to flag the recording. They did. I copied it onto an external drive and placed that, like everything else, into the drawer where I kept the unacknowledged history of a case that officially did not, and never had, existed. That night, I didn't drive to the creek. I went home, made coffee, sat at the table, opened my notebook, not to write, but to read it from the beginning. Every line, every entry, every small, careful fact. The handwriting shifted slightly across the months, subtle evidence of fatigue, of steady hands on some days, of slower writing on others. But the record held, tangible, weighty, a life, or the outline of one, sketched in patient graphite. At the end of the last page, I wrote one final sentence. Not a conclusion, not a summary, just a truth. I was here. I closed the book, turned off the light, slept. In the morning, the sun rose like it always does, indifferent to paperwork and memory and the fragile edges of human perception. I went to work, put on the uniform, checked the cruiser, listened to briefing, responded to calls, did the job, and somewhere, beyond the reach of official history, a small, unmarked space by a slow creek continued to exist, sometimes acknowledged, sometimes not, as quietly and stubbornly as the man whose name rarely stayed written. I don't expect closure. I don't require proof. All I ask of the world, and of myself, is that, when something flickers in and out of the record, we don't dismiss the parts we can't file neatly away. We just remember, calmly, steadily, without drama, because sometimes the witness is the only archive a life ever gets. And if that's the role I was given in this one small, inexplicable story, I will carry it with care. I used to think closure was something you could hold, a form you could sign, a box you could check, a final paragraph at the end of a report. After enough years in uniform, you learn that most stories don't end. They just grow quiet and leave you to decide how much of yourself you're willing to keep listening with. The case by the creek has been quiet a long while now. Not resolved. Not forgotten. Just quiet. Sometimes, I still pass the turnoff on my way to another call. The road looks like any other. Ruts, sagebrush, fence wire hanging tired between posts. The windmill keeps turning with that patient metallic ache. The creek moves at the pace of someone who has nothing left to prove. If I stop, which I rarely do, the land greets me the same way it always has. By pretending I'm not there. The post is still in the ground. Weathered further now, cracked at the grain. A marker that refuses to say what it marks. No one's claimed it. No one's removed it. It remains the only visible sentence in a story the world declined to write. At work, we still answer calls. We still thread ourselves through other people's worst and most ordinary days. When I sit in briefing, surrounded by familiar voices, coffee steam rising like quiet ghosts from paper cups, I feel grounded. Reality stacks itself into manageable pieces. Dates, times, addresses, outcomes. The kind of solidity you can build a life on. But I also know, calmly without drama, that there is a narrow seam in that solidity. A place at the edge of the record where a life once tried to exist and kept slipping out of the paperwork like water through fingers. I don't question it anymore. I just acknowledge it. The recruit I mentioned earlier has grown more comfortable in the job. We don't talk about the case directly, but sometimes during long drives they'll ask thoughtful questions about documentation, memory, procedure. I tell them the truth as best I can. Get it down while it's fresh. Be exact. Avoid unnecessary details. Respect the gaps. Understand that not everything that matters will sit still long enough to be typed into a box. The records clerk still keeps immaculate files. She calls me when anomalies appear. Small glitches, fragments, stray database echoes. We treat them as technical issues. Sometimes they are. Sometimes they aren't. We don't assume either way. We just do the work. I thought for a while that the anonymous voicemails were finished. Then, months later, another one arrived. Short, breathless in the way those valley winds can make you sound, even when you're not afraid. Still here, the voice said. That was all. No name, no location, just a quiet insistence. I didn't trace it. I didn't file it. I wrote it down, date, time, exact words, and slipped the paper into the same drawer where everything else lives. Not as evidence, just acknowledgement. A leaf pressed between pages so it doesn't vanish entirely. My notebook is nearly full now. The spine is softened. The corners are worn. If you ran your fingers along the paper, you'd feel the raised texture where the pencil bit deeper some days. You'd see pauses in the handwriting where I let the silence catch up. It isn't a story. It isn't a case file. It's just the residue of one person paying attention longer than the system expected them to. Sometimes, when I'm off duty, I walk down to the river. The water doesn't care about reports or ledgers. It remembers only the shape of the land it's touched. The current keeps moving whether anyone records it or not. That realization is both humbling and comforting. I've wondered gently whether I was chosen for this simply because I didn't look away quickly enough. Not singled out, just available. A steady witness in a world that doesn't always have time for continuity. If that's the case, I don't resent it. Bearing witness is part of the oath too, even when the form doesn't exist. There are still occasional flashes. A fleeting mention from a community member. A shadow familiar in posture but not in identity, walking a country road at dusk. A name that appears in conversation like a skipped stone touching water, then sinking before you can reach for it. When that happens, I don't chase it. I just quietly acknowledge it and let it go. Because I've learned the difference between searching and honoring. Searching demands answers. Honoring allows the unanswered to remain. I don't expect the world to return the trailer, or the ledger entry, or the missing case numbers. I don't expect clarity. I don't even expect truth in the clean sense of the word. All I expect for myself is that I won't pretend it never happened simply because the official record failed to hold it. I've seen enough loss, enough quiet departures, to know that being remembered, however imperfectly, is its own kind of survival. So if you ask me today whether the man by the creek existed, I will tell you calmly, yes. Not because I can prove it, but because some part of the world pressed against my life for a while and left an outline I refuse to erase. And if one day, long after I'm gone, someone opens this notebook and reads these lines, perhaps they will understand that what mattered most was not the missing data or the erased entries or the vanished addresses. It was that, for a time, one person was willing to stand in the cold beside a slow creek beneath a turning windmill and say, without fear or certainty, I see you. Then close the book. Then keep going. Because the work is never finished. It only grows quiet.